There's a story that America buried under silence, under shame, under decades of deliberate forgetting. A story that was scrubbed from textbooks, omitted from official records, and left to rot in the memories of survivors who were told in no uncertain terms to never speak of it again. It is the story of a community so prosperous, so thriving, so breathtakingly alive, that when the hatred came for it, the hatred came with airplanes and machine guns, and a mob tens of thousands strong. This is the story of Greenwood, Oklahoma. This is the story of Black Wall Street. And this is the story of how it was erased in a single night and how that erasure was then erased again, hidden beneath the floorboards of American history for nearly a century. You need to understand what Greenwood was before you can understand what was lost. Because when most people hear the words race massacre, they imagine chaos, they imagine poverty, they imagine desperation colliding with hatred in some dark corner of a forgotten city. But Greenwood was none of those things. Greenwood was extraordinary. Greenwood was a miracle built by hand, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, in the years following the Civil War, a gleaming, self-sufficient black metropolis rising up out of the red clay soil of northeastern Oklahoma. By 1921, the Greenwood District of Tulsa was home to more than 10,000 black residents. It had its own hospitals, its own law firms, its own newspapers, its own schools and churches and grocery stores and hotels. It had 2 movie theaters, too, at a time when most black Americans couldn't sit in the same theater as white people anywhere in the country. It had a library. It had a bus system. It had dentists and doctors and lawyers and architects and real estate agents and entrepreneurs who had built empires from nothing, from less than nothing, from the ruins of slavery and the daily violence of Jim Crow. The money that circulated in Greenwood circulated within Greenwood. A dollar spent in that neighborhood changed hands dozens of times before it ever left. That was the genius of it. That was the power of it. And it was that power, that undeniable, unapologetic, visible black prosperity that made certain white men in Tulsa deeply, pathologically furious. Let's go back to the beginning, to the summer of 1921, to a city already trembling with racial tension, already primed like a powder keg, in a country still reeling from the aftermath of World War I, the Red Summer of 1919, and the resurgent terror of the Ku Klux Klan, which by 1921 had swelled to millions of members nationwide and operated not in the shadows but in broad daylight, with the blessing of mayors and sheriffs and judges and congressmen. This was the world that Greenwood existed in. This was the air that Black Tulsans breathed every single day, the constant knowledge that the law did not protect them, that the courts did not see them, that the mob was always one spark away from igniting. The spark, when it came, was almost absurdly small, almost tragically ordinary. On the morning of May 30th, 1921, a 19-year-old black shoeshiner named Dick Rowland entered an elevator in a downtown Tulsa building. The elevator was operated by a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page. What happened in that elevator, in that small metal box in those few seconds, has never been definitively established. A cry was heard. Rowland ran. Someone called the police. The most likely explanation, pieced together from the accounts of those who knew both young people, is that Rowland stumbled, grabbed Page's arm to steady himself, and she screamed in surprise. Others have suggested they knew each other, that there may have been a romantic entanglement. What is certain is this: nothing happened in that elevator that warranted what came next. Nothing that happened in that elevator could justify what came next. Rowland was arrested the following morning, May 31st, and then the Tulsa Tribune published an article that has since disappeared from the historical record, torn from the bound volumes of the paper in what many historians believe was a deliberate act of destruction, an article with an inflammatory headline that accused Dick Rowland of attacking Sarah Page. That article was a match thrown onto a pile of gasoline-soaked rags. By the afternoon of May 31st, a white mob had gathered outside the courthouse where Rowland was being held, demanding that he be handed over to them. Everyone in that crowd knew what handed over meant. Everyone in Tulsa that day knew what happened to black men who were handed over to white mobs in America in 1921. Word reached Greenwood, and here is where the story takes a turn that white America has always found deeply uncomfortable, because the black men of Greenwood did not cower, they did not hide, they organized. A group of black veterans, men who had fought for this country in the trenches of World War I, men who had crossed an ocean and risked their lives under the American flag, men who had been promised implicitly that their service would earn them citizenship in the fullest sense of that word. These men armed themselves, drove to the courthouse, and offered to help protect Dick Rowland from the mob. The sheriff turned them away. They came back again, they were turned away again. On their third trip, as the crowd of white men surged and jostled outside, a shot was fired. To this day, no one knows who fired it, but it was the shot that ended everything. The white mob had been waiting for a reason. They had their reason now. They surged back toward Greenwood, and as they moved, they were joined by more men, hundreds than thousands, armed with rifles, with pistols, with torches. Some of them had been deputized by the city of Tulsa itself. The city of Tulsa, in the hours that followed, effectively became a participant in the attack. Police officers did not protect black residents, they arrested them. Officers who had been given arms and authority to maintain order instead used that authority to round up black men and women at gunpoint and herd them into holding facilities. The convention center, the fairgrounds, a baseball stadium. As many as 10,000 Black Tulsans, the majority of the district's population, were arrested and interned. They were disarmed. They were stripped of the ability to defend themselves or their homes, and while they sat in those holding pens, the mob had free rein. What happened in Greenwood on the night of May 31st and into the early morning hours of June 1st, 1921, was not a riot. A riot implies chaos, implies an absence of direction. What happened in Greenwood was organized, methodical, and catastrophic. It was a military-style assault on a civilian neighborhood. Eyewitness accounts recorded decades later by historians who went looking for what official records had buried describe white men moving systematically through the streets, entering every home and business, looting everything of value, and then setting the buildings on fire. They moved from block to block. They burned it all. The hotels, the law offices, the grocery stores, the churches, the library, the 2 movie theaters, the homes. Nearly 40 square blocks of the most prosperous black community in America gone, burned to ash. And then there were the planes. This is the detail that stops people cold. That makes people say, wait, that can't be right, but it is right, it is documented. It is corroborated by multiple witnesses and by the physical evidence of bullet holes found in buildings after the massacre. At least one plane, possibly more, flew over Greenwood during the attack. The Oklahoma National Guard later claimed the planes were used only for reconnaissance, to observe the situation from above, but survivors testified otherwise. Survivors described bullets and incendiary devices being dropped from those planes onto the neighborhood below. Some historians have concluded that the aerial component remains ambiguous. What is not ambiguous is that the planes existed, that they flew over a neighborhood being destroyed, and that the United States government and the state of Oklahoma would spend the next century pretending that none of it ever happened. By sunrise on June 1, 1921, it was over. Greenwood was gone. 35 square blocks, some accounts say as many as 40, had been reduced to rubble and ash. Hundreds of homes destroyed. Hundreds of businesses erased. Between 100 and 300 people dead. The true number has never been established because the records were destroyed, the bodies were buried in unmarked mass graves, and the survivors were too terrified to speak. Over 10,000 black residents left homeless overnight. Left homeless not by nature, not by accident, but by their neighbors, their police force, and their government. And then came the second destruction, the one that lasted longer, the one that may have done even more damage. Within days, the city of Tulsa began working not to help the survivors, but to prevent them from rebuilding. City officials proposed redevelopment schemes that would have converted the ruins of Greenwood into an industrial zone, permanently displacing the black residents who had lived there. Insurance companies denied every single claim filed by Greenwood's property owners, every single one citing riot exclusion clauses in their policies. Not one black business owner, not one black homeowner received a cent in insurance payment. The courts provided no remedy. The city provided no aid. The state provided no investigation. The white men who had participated in the massacre, the men who had looted and killed and burned, were never charged, never tried, never convicted, not one of them. Not one in the entire bloody history of what happened in Tulsa on May 31st and June 1st, 1921, was ever held accountable by any court in the United States. The survivors rebuilt anyway, because that is what people do, because Greenwood was not just buildings and businesses, it was a community, a culture, a way of being in the world, and that cannot be burned. By the late 1920s, a new Greenwood was rising from the ashes, new buildings going up on the same streets, new businesses opening in the same neighborhood. The community was resilient in ways that defied explanation, but it was never the same. The wealth that had been accumulated over decades was gone. The confidence, the sheer, extraordinary confidence of a community that had built something extraordinary, had been shaken in ways that echoed through generations. And over the following decades, the massacre itself was quietly, systematically removed from the record. The Tulsa Race Massacre, they called it a riot in the few documents that mentioned it at all, a deliberate linguistic choice that shifted blame onto the victims, was not taught in Oklahoma schools. It was not mentioned in state history books. The survivors, who carried the trauma of it in their bodies for the rest of their lives, were strongly discouraged from discussing it publicly. There was a cultural code of silence in Tulsa, enforced by social pressure and the lingering threat of violence that held for decades. Children grew up in that city without knowing what had happened. White children, certainly, but even many black children whose grandparents had survived the massacre were kept in the dark, because their grandparents were afraid, because their grandparents had seen what happened to people who remembered too loudly. The silence began to crack in the 1970s, when Black Tulsa historians and journalists started piecing together what had happened through oral histories, through interviews with the dwindling number of survivors, through the patient, painstaking work of digging through archives that had been deliberately depleted. In 1996, 75 years after the massacre, the Oklahoma State Legislature finally commissioned an official investigation. The Tulsa Race Riot Commission, as it was called, spent 5 years investigating and in 2001 released a report that confirmed what survivors had always known. A prosperous black community had been systematically destroyed by a mob that included law enforcement officials, with the complicity of city and state government, and not a single person had ever been held accountable. The report recommended reparations. The state legislature declined to enact them. The survivors who were still living when that report was released were very old. Some of them had been children during the massacre, had watched, as small boys and girls, as their world was set on fire. Leslie Benningfield Randall, known as Mother Randall, was a little girl in 1921. She lived to be 107 years old, and she remembered. She testified before Congress in 2021, 100 years after the massacre, at the age of 107. She described what she saw, she described running, she described the fire. She said that the city of Tulsa and the state of Oklahoma owed the survivors and their descendants something real, not ceremonies, not apologies, but actual material redress for actual material harm. Congress listened politely, and then Congress did nothing. There is something you should sit with for a moment, something that does not get said often enough with the directness it deserves. The destruction of Black Wall Street was not an accident of history. It was not an explosion of uncontrollable passion that unfortunate circumstances ignited. It was a choice, a series of choices made by men who knew exactly what they were doing. The men who burned Greenwood chose to burn it. The police officers who arrested black residents and disarmed them while white rioters attacked their homes, they chose to do that. The city officials who then blocked rebuilding and denied insurance claims and killed investigations, they chose to do that. And the generations of textbook writers and politicians and educators who decided that this story did not need to be told, that American children did not need to know that their country had done this, they chose that too. Every silence was a choice. Every omission was a choice. And here's why that matters. Here is why this story, which is 100 years old, which is over, which involved people who are now dead, why it matters in a way that is immediate and urgent and alive. Because the wealth that was destroyed in Greenwood was not just money, it was intergenerational wealth. It was the capital that would have funded the next generation's education, and the generation after that's businesses, and the generation after that's homes. The economists who have studied Greenwood estimate that the economic damage calculated forward through the decades, accounting for the compound growth of the assets that were destroyed, runs into the billions of dollars. The destruction of Black Wall Street did not end in 1921. Its effects are still echoing. They echo in the racial wealth gap that defines American economic life today. They echo in every study that shows black families hold a fraction of the wealth of comparable white families. The fire is out, but the ash is still there. We are standing in the ash right now. The story of Greenwood was rediscovered in a serious way in the late 2010s, driven partly by scholars and activists who had never stopped telling it, and partly by the arrival of social media platforms that allowed that telling to reach audiences that traditional gatekeepers could not censor. When HBO's Watchmen series opened in 2019 with a stunning, devastating recreation of the massacre, images of fire raining down on a prosperous black neighborhood, of families running through smoke-filled streets, of a world being destroyed, millions of Americans watched it and thought, wait, is that real? Did that actually happen? And they went looking, and they found the history, and they were furious. Furious that no one had told them. Furious that this had been hidden. Furious at the scale and the deliberateness of the hiding. In 2021, on the 100th anniversary of the massacre, the city of Tulsa held commemorations. President Biden visited, speeches were made, flowers were laid, and the three last known survivors, Leslie Benningfield Randall, Hughes Van Ellis, and Viola Fletcher, sat before Congress and told their stories, their voices steady and their eyes clear even at 100 years old. Viola Fletcher testified, "I have lived through the massacre every day, for 100 years. Every single day." The question of reparations remains unresolved. Lawsuits filed on behalf of survivors and their descendants have wound through the courts for years. In 2023, an Oklahoma judge dismissed a reparations lawsuit, ruling that the plaintiffs had not proven ongoing harm. The fight continues. The survivors who were still alive when those lawsuits were filed have now died. Leslie Randall, the last known survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre, died in October 2023 at the age of 109. She died without seeing justice. She died without receiving $1 of the restitution that she and her community were owed. She died in a country that held a ceremony for the 100th anniversary of the massacre and then allowed her to die poor and uncompensated, while the descendants of the men who burned her neighborhood live comfortably on the wealth that was never redistributed, in a city that was allowed to prosper on land that should never have been taken. I want you to remember her name, Leslie Benningfield Randall. I want you to remember what she saw as a little girl running through the burning streets of Greenwood. I want you to remember that she lived for 109 years carrying that memory, and that the country she lived in never made it right. Not really. Not in the way that justice actually requires, not with the restitution of what was stolen, only with the acknowledgement of the theft. And even that acknowledgement came late. And even that acknowledgement was partial. And even that acknowledgement was contested by people who thought it was too much to ask. History is not the past. That is the lie we tell ourselves so we can sleep. History is the present wearing different clothes. The prosperity that was burned in Greenwood did not simply cease to exist, it was transferred. The land, in many cases, was bought at fire sale prices in the months after the massacre by the same people who had helped destroy it. The insurance money that should have paid out to black policyholders instead stayed in the accounts of insurance companies. The economic position that Greenwood would have occupied in the decades that followed, the businesses that would have grown, the wealth that would have compounded, the political power that wealth enables, all of it was redirected. Somewhere, into something. The question of where it went is not rhetorical. It is an accounting question, one that has never been seriously attempted. This is the story they tried to bury. They buried it in newspaper archives with missing pages. They buried it in textbooks that skipped from Reconstruction to the Civil Rights Movement without stopping in Tulsa. They buried it in the careful silence of survivors who were too frightened to speak. They buried it in the studied ignorance of generations who were never given the tools to ask the right questions. But here is what burial cannot accomplish. Burial cannot change what happened. Burial cannot erase the lives that were lived in Greenwood, the community that was built there, the extraordinary human achievement that a group of Black Americans accomplished in one of the most hostile environments in American history. Those people existed. That community was real. Those streets were real. That wealth was real. And the fire that consumed it was real, and the mob that set it was real, and the silence that followed was real, and the injustice that silence protected was real. And the effects of that injustice are real right now in the world we all live in today. Black Wall Street was real and they burned it, and now you know.